As we said, the session is now going to go to more the high-tech and new economy. And to address data-driven discrimination, essentially the clash of big data and stereotyping. We have asked Joaquin Alvarado to be the moderator, and he'll introduce the panel. Joaquin is the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Investigative Reporting. He's been a longtime Aspen Institute participant since his days as a professor at San Francisco State University, where he was the founding director of the Institute for Next Generation Internet. He proposed the National Public Light Path, which was always an interesting activity. He founded Coco Studios. He was the founding Senior Vice President for Diversity and Innovation at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and also was a Senior Vice President for Digital Innovation at American Public Media. Joaquin Alvarado.
Michael. Thank you, Charlie, and thanks to the panel that preceded us. That's a very intimate story in some sense because it has to do with the communities that we actually live in. I'm from Oakland, California, and we have been confronting those same challenges, and I thought it was a very thoughtful discussion. We're going to go in a slightly different direction and look at the rise of big data as it concerns issues of discrimination, race relations, and privacy. I'd be willing to bet that there's nobody in this room without a cell phone with a data plan, right? Which means that all day today you have been exuding your personal data to multiple agents, both in the for-profit sector and also government. We live in a time where you can almost not escape surveillance. And in minority communities particularly, there's a troubled history with that issue. What we do at the Center for Investigative Reporting is cover things when they go wrong. So we've actually done a lot of reporting on issues related to big data, community relationships, the militarization of the police forces inside of this country. But today we're going to have a conversation about what are the potential impacts and where are these sort of tensions, as Juan used the term earlier, between industry and government, between the regulatory framework that we have currently and where the future is taking us, and what are the needs of citizens and consumers as it relates to a media environment that never turns off anymore. So our access to content, rich content, important content, and David brought it up in terms of the digital divide issues. If we want our children to be educated for the new economy that is being built all across this country and that is highly competitive, they have to be data savvy and media ready. So I'm going to start by just welcoming our panelists. At the far right is Commissioner Julie Brill from the Federal Trade Commission. To her left is Michael Fertik, the Chief Executive Officer of Reputation.com. And Kim Keenan is to my right, the Chief Executive Officer of the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. Welcome. Commissioner Brill, I'm going to start with you because in some sense the question of how do you regulate this new frontier of big data and how do you educate citizens about what the critical issues are, I think is pretty front and center. What is happening at the Commission now to take this on?
So there are lots of issues around how data is being used, how it's being collected, and how it's impacting individuals, whether they're consumers or just, as you were saying, citizens. And it's a very, very complex ecosystem. You know, one of the things that we think about, of course, is the entities that consumers are interfacing with, that they have what we call a first-party relationship, whether it's Facebook or Google or whomever. And there we really are focused on whether consumers are receiving accurate information about how their data is being collected and used, and trying to educate consumers, as well as those consumer-facing companies, about what tools can be better provided to consumers. So we want consumers to be active. We want consumers to understand how to control their privacy, how to control their data collection to the extent that they have those choices, and we want companies to give them choices. But when it comes to big data, which is really the topic of our conversation, there are many, many other entities at play, which you alluded to in your opening remarks. You know, whether it's data brokers, whether it's data analytics firms, or whether it's other entities that are collecting information behind the scenes. Consumers aren't interacting with them directly. And so right now, in today's ecosystem, it's very difficult for consumers to exercise any control. Largely, or one of the initial problems is consumers have no idea who these entities are. You know, they're not names that come trippingly off your tongue in the way that, you know, the consumer-facing companies may. So consumers don't know who they are, they don't understand the ecosystem, and they're also not given, in my view, adequate tools, even if they could find who these companies are. So we at the FTC have started to look into some of these issues. We, about a couple of years ago, issued a report about data brokers, which was based on a very detailed study of 9 data brokers and their practices. And we talked about the ecosystem. We talked about the way in which these entities are segmenting consumers for advertising purposes, but then also to make more substantive decisions about consumers. And some of the segments are fine. You know, they're sort of innocuous. You know, are you a gardener? Do you like dogs or cats? But we also found segmentations that were broken down along clear racial and financial status lines, sexual orientation, as well as health issues. So that we saw segments that were called, and it really doesn't matter what they're called, what really matters is how consumers are being broken down and what kind of consumers go into these segments. We found segments of like urban scrambler, or rural and barely making it, or second city ethnic struggler. And these were groups of individuals who fit those categorizations either based upon their race or their financial status or where they lived or all of those things together that were then, and those lists of consumers could be purchased by others for advertising purposes or to make substantive decisions about them. These, I think, are some of the most critical issues that we face in the big data world. This is big data. This is, in my view, this is big data. This is data that is being aggregated from across the ecosystem to try to categorize individuals and to segment them. Now, we'll talk a little bit, I assume, about how this can be used for good and how it can be used for bad. But the FTC is, which is the Federal Trade Commission, which is the nation's, in many ways, leading consumer protection agency and certainly leading privacy and data security agency, we have definitely been speaking and thinking about these issues. We also did a workshop focused even more specifically than just data brokers, but on the issue of inclusion and exclusion. How big data can be used to include consumers into the credit system or other very important benefits that we have in society, but how the very same data can be used to exclude them. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about this. We're not the only entity. The White House did a report on big data and you know, how it can be used for good and how it can be used for bad. And there are of course, other agencies thinking about it too. But these are some really big questions and really important questions.
Well, I think I'm going to pass it over to you, Michael, but just to make a note, redlining, right, is almost 100 years old in this country, and in some ways created a structural element to poverty in urban communities across the country that then resulted in the issues that we heard about in the first panel. But I worry, and I'll have to fully disclose here, I just joined the Consumer Reports board, so I'm thinking a lot about this now, that the conversation is not really penetrating the average citizen, right? And it's not something that they are really sort of weighing their choices, right, and understanding that they have choices. Now, Michael, you've written about a tale of two internets almost. One where you have those who are aware and are segmented up the food chain, and those who could be completely ghettoized on the internet and treated in a way that would lead to inequitable outcomes for their place in this country.
Yeah, that's true. So first of all, if you care about privacy and data privacy, then you should be rooting for Julie Brill because she's flying the flag at the FTC on these issues. So she's your lady. The FTC as a group is also interested in this, but Julie is the one who's advancing this set of topics at the FTC. I've watched her do it for about half a dozen years, plus or minus, right? And she's still doing it. So if you care about this, then you should care about Julie and her effort. So the article to which our host adverted that I wrote is a Scientific American article that I wrote a couple years ago, which will show up online as the rich see a different internet from the poor. I'll leave it to your imagination as to what rich means in the context of race and poor means in the context of race. In the magazine, it was called A Tale of Two Internets. And I have, in the job that I've got, I just published a book called The Reputation Economy, which was a New York Times bestseller in January, which covers some of these same issues. Part of the job I've got is to expose how data and something called an algorithm, which I'll explain in a second, start to segment people very decisively in ways that have some downstream consequences. So in this article, which is short, you can read it during this panel if you'd like, I put together...
After the panel.
Wait till the panel. I put together some of the research that we've done, but also others have done, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, others, showing that if you live in a certain zip code, or if you live which on the internet looks like an IP address, sort of knows where you are geographically, then you will call up a certain e-commerce website and get one price for a product. And if you live in a different zip code, meaning if you have a different IP address, you call up the same product on the same website, you get a different price. And these are the kinds of things that you can start to see. This has a lot of consequences when it comes to things that are even more salient for a person's life, like health insurance. So we've been documenting this. I want to give you a couple sentences on how we got here, as the computer person probably in this room. So there are three inventions that have come together in the last 10, 15 years that are changing the footing underneath our feet, the ground underneath our feet. The first is free search. So Google is a very powerful search engine, and there are search technologies that make searching and finding data very possible, very easy. The second is something called the cloud. We've all heard about the cloud. The cloud is basically just a lot of computers that make storage very cheap. So for the first time in human history, not in technical history, for the first time in human history, it is now cheaper to store something forever than it is to delete it. Okay? That's a new default setting for humanity. We don't know how to deal with it yet. And the third thing is a technology suite called Hadoop or MapReduce, which you probably will not have heard of, but very soon you will be using, whether you know you're using it or not, you'll be benefiting from it. Hadoop and MapReduce are technologies that make analytics very possible by people who are educated but not skilled in the art of analytics. In the same way that probably most of you have used Microsoft Excel, which made it possible for people who are educated but not skilled in the art of numbers to use numbers, Hadoop and MapReduce will make it possible for people who are educated but not skilled in the art of analytics to do analysis. So if everything is stored forever and is findable immediately and can be analyzed by many, many, many people very easily and cheaply, everything will have a score. And the score will determine our access to goods and services, our access to products that we'd like to have. And those scores will be generated by something called an algorithm. An algorithm is a fancy word for a formula or a set of instructions that you give a computer to look at data and do in different ways. So the kind of the far out thing that I'd like to highlight for our discussion today is that the secrets of the future, the secret categorizations of the future, are not going to be available under subpoena or under investigation, even by something as powerful as the FTC. The categorizations of the future will be invisible because they will lie at an algorithmic level. And therefore, if we want to forestall that future, if we want instead to have transparency and visibility into those things, we must organize ourselves around something called algorithmic transparency, which means that if you're going to put me in a certain bucket, I need to know how I got in that bucket. So there are a lot of ways to describe black to a computer that have nothing to do with the word black. And you can hide that very capably if you want to, and no one will ever know. So the thing that I think we have to, and I know Julia and her team are already thinking about this, the thing that we have to think about if we don't want that future is something called algorithmic transparency that will allow us to know how you got into the bucket. Because if you don't know how you got into the bucket, we'll never know. So imagine, let's take race out of it, imagine the most sophisticated Soviet Stasi data-rich scenario in the world And by the way, I'm a super pro-commerce person. I'm an entrepreneur, right? I mean, this is what I do. I've raised $81 million for my company in venture capital. I'm pro-commerce. I believe in this stuff. What I don't believe in is a new and systematized semi-state of little brother. I'm not worried about the cops, actually. I'm not worried about big brother. I'm worried about little brother. The companies that will take your data and make decisions about you without your knowledge or permission for purposes you can never know.
Let me, Michael, bring it over here to Kim, because there's a long history. Minorities are not passive actors in the United States. We are active contributors to this country's rich legacy and have, in many cases, negotiated our own futures and taken actions at the ownership level, at the policy level, at the legislative level. Can you reflect on this for us? Because I think that between these two statements, the evidence that was gathered and the report that has already been made by the FTC and the work of the commissioner, and the future that we're wandering into that Michael has outlined, you could see how it could go very wrong.
Oh, yeah.
What are you guys doing in terms of this issue?
Well, at MMTC, you know, we're very focused on the advocacy and the social justice of it. And so, you know, it's so funny. I'm like so in the last panel, you know, and all they talked about was trust and transparency. Well, guess what? We're going to talk about trust and transparency, because that's essentially what this is. I mean, we're at this sort of new age in the ecosystem, and now everybody's trying to figure out how we balance this, because we know that what he's saying is coming.
Yeah.
But the question is, what does it mean, you know, if you live in, you know, a part of the city that's extraordinarily urban, you know, where I was just saying I traveled around the country when I was with NAACP, and I went to a city that had 4 check cashing places on every corner. It had one on all 4 corners. I kept thinking, how do they compete? It's 4 on every, I mean, it wasn't like 2 corners, it was 4 corners. I was very concerned about that. But I mean, imagine
Like Starbucks.
online, right? Okay, so the Starbucks in this community is a check cashing place. Okay, you know, so that's wrong, right, on its face. But now, if I go online and I'm dealing with some app that allows me to do that, now some hidden algorithm, right, some
How
hidden
close do you live
formula
to a check cashing place?
is going to now track, and they're going to say, hey, this is a person who uses check cashing. So now I'm going to send them these high interest rate loans.
Yep.
I'm going to project that their credit score must be low. I'm going to project that they don't need banks. You know, we talked a little about redlining, and I think it's going to be much more insidious. You know, before you just said so-and-so doesn't put their bank in our neighborhood, they're redlining, right? They're in every other neighborhood, they're in every other town. But now, just my part of the city doesn't have this. But now, are we really going to know? They're going to say, the people who want to use our digital service don't live there, can't afford it. So we're not going to access those communities. So that means now we're going to have these digital deserts, right? They're going to be, you know, deserts of communities that don't have access, that aren't adopting. And guess what? Talk about a tale of 2 cities. Now we've got a tale of 2 young people. One young person who can get on the internet and do anything, anywhere, anytime, and one child who doesn't know how to get on the internet, who doesn't have access, who doesn't have a Starbucks on that corner because there's a check cashing place. So now he doesn't have free access to internet, and he can't do his homework. And so this child, right, has to do another economy. So now he's back in the algorithm for the police department, right? Because he's that child, right? He doesn't have anything else to do. He's not going forward. And so we have to be really thoughtful that we don't wind up in the tail of this other city side by side our other city. And so that's very important
data
to
point,
us.
just a very quick data point on this. It is illegal, we know this, to show a white person and a black person a different credit offer on the basis of their race. However, you can work around this by not showing the black person any offer at all.
Right.
Okay? So this is what I documented and started documenting in the Scientific American piece. And it's not mostly my work, it's mostly work that I've put together. But this is just to pay you back. This is a concrete data point that is in the market today, that is not as sophisticated as the stuff that's coming.
Let me ask the question, how long do you give the industry, right? A lot of it's centered in Silicon Valley, which likes to sing its own praises about how progressive and forward-thinking it is, but yet is very homogenous, as David pointed out in the beginning of this day. How much time do you give the industry to sort this all out and figure it out? I mean, we are lucky that a lot of these internet companies are born in the United States. It's an important driver of the economy, so we don't want to strangle that. So how does the FTC find a place to negotiate this?
So we have certainly called for Congress to enact some laws to build the trust, the precise issue that Kim was raising. You know, big data can be a tool for inclusion. You know, it can be a tool that will allow banks, for instance, to find the underserved, the unbanked or the underbanked, to reach out to them, to give them introductory products or offering products to them that will help bring them into the banking system. The problem that I see is the very same data, urban scrambler, ethnic second city struggler, whatever we want to call that segment, the very same data can be used to target those underserved, underbanked individuals for payday loans, for scams, and for other problems. And we have seen that in a couple of our cases. You know, what lead generators are doing when they say to a consumer, you know, are you looking for a payday loan? Give us your information online, we'll get you a loan. And what they do is then send that information to all sorts of entities. So what we have been calling for at the FTC is we have been calling for Congress to adopt a law around data brokers to try to bring much more trust to this system, to try to develop a place where consumers can go to see what kind of data they have, the data brokers have about them, so that they can make corrections to the extent that the information is being used for substantive decisions, for credit decisions, or for something that's close to a credit decision, like are you a risky customer? Are you a customer that can be trusted? Those are the kinds of things where I believe consumers absolutely need to be able to correct the information if it's incorrect. Then we also believe that if the information is being used for marketing purposes, you know, are you a gardener? Are you someone who wants cars? Are you someone who's interested in guns? Whatever it is, that consumers should be able to say, no, I don't want my information used for marketing purposes. So those kind of tools need to be given to consumers. But look, Congress has a lot on its plate.
Yeah, how's that going?
Senator Markey and others have introduced a bill along these lines, and I'm very hopeful that a discussion will take place about it. But there's a lot going on in Congress.
Let me push a little bit on this.
So, I just want to get to your question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
That was all by lead-in.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
No,
to your actual
go for it.
question, which is, what do we expect industry to do while we're waiting for laws to be enacted?
Yes.
And I do believe that there is a lot that industry can do to bring much more trust to the system. Industry doesn't need to wait for a law to be enacted in order to set up a portal that consumers can go to see what the major data brokers are saying about them, and to be able to start to make these choices. You know, I 2 or 3 years ago called this Reclaim Your Name. I want individuals to be able to reclaim their name so that they understand what information is being used about them in all of these services, and being able to interact more in a more immersive and understandable way. So these are the kinds of things that industry can do. But it's not just data brokers. It's not just an issue about data brokers. Each and every individual company, as Michael just said, will be able to use the incredible analytics tools that are available to figure out on their own what they think about their customers and how they want to treat their own customers. And so each and every company needs to start saying, what are we doing when we figure out who should go to the head of our customer service line, you know, on the phone or on the internet, and who we want to stall and we don't want to give immediate service to? Are there some impacts here that fall along the lines of vulnerable communities and where we're treating people in a disparate way? Those are the kind of questions that individual companies need to start asking themselves.
So, Michael, are they asking those questions? Do you have any hope that companies on their own will self-regulate and put a good foot forward that starts to move us in a positive direction?
Capital serves capital. So there will be a lot of things that will be very attractively done by companies on their own. I don't think that data brokers will, in particular, I don't think they'll self-regulate. I think that they will regulate under pressure or act well under pressure. We've seen that happen. My company is the only one of scale in the world that will take you out of multiple data brokerages, as you know, Julie, all at once, because I don't think that they should have your data. I think you should own your data. Look, there are, first of all, let's just be clear. Everybody gets defrauded on the internet, okay? So it's not one particular set of communities that's getting defrauded. Elderly, wealthy people, people in Georgia, people in the country of Georgia, everyone's getting attacked by usually a set of sort of poor acting Russians who are targeting people for their money. So everyone's getting targeted. There's no sort of special group that's getting targeted more. Then there are things that you want commerce to be able to do, right? You want commerce to be able to say, this customer is a high-paying customer. Let's get the call first from the high-paying customer. This customer calls us every 9 hours. Let's not answer his call because this person calls us every day. So you want companies to be able to do that. What you don't want is impermissible criteria to discriminate or impermissible criteria to determine it. Look, I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist as an American. I'm an optimist as an entrepreneur. I think the future is good, but the future is good because we pay attention to it. And so yeah, I think we'll cure a lot of these things. But I don't think that Silicon Valley thinks about DC as much as it should. And I think DC's cardinal sin is that it thinks that the internet is Google and Facebook.
Not everybody in
No,
Washington.
not everyone.
No, we can tell there's somebody.
Present company excluded.
Fair enough.
But on that point, because there is a tension, right, between what technology would do on its own without any rules and what has to happen to balance our democracy, right? So from your perspective, Kim, I want to come back to the other side of this, which is will all communities be able to benefit from the positive advantages of big data, right? So we fought for years on the digital divide access issue, and that's still a problem. We're still fighting that issue.
Yes.
What do you anticipate could be some positive outcomes from communities of color, diverse income communities being able to actually leverage big data for positive outcomes?
Well, again, I'm an optimist too, but I'm one of these people who is like, I trust, but I verify, right? So I think that,
like Ronald Reagan.
Right. Well, hey, you got to do what you got to do, and I think that you can put something in a certain context and have it mean certain things, but at the same time, we have to be more alert. It's so funny. I really feel like I'm channeling the other panel, just so you can tell I was an attorney. But the reality is that we have responsibility for this too, and I think that the more we can educate more communities, and I do think there is that the impact in a community of color could be more disparate, because one, if they're not connected, one, if they're redlined and they're only getting the sort of higher cost thing, so now they're being robbed twice, right? Because if they're not digitally connected, then the innovation economy is gone to them. Well, if the innovation economy is gone to them and they wind up in what I'd like to call the prison economy, well then now not only is their family being stripped of wealth, but the people around them are being stripped of wealth, right? Because if you're in jail and you have to pay 20 times what it costs to use a prison payphone, and your family's calling you, and now they make choices, right? Instead of eating out, we're going to use our money to call our loved one in prison, because if we don't call him, then he stays in the prison economy, and now his new family is in jail with him and not us. And so now we've stripped the community of a potential person. We've stripped this family of the wealth. They paid for lawyers, they've bonded their houses, now they're paying double. So now they're at the check cashing place. So the downside for them is really more of a spiral.
So how can it help? Forgive me, I'm sorry.
Well, I'll bring up the example that the chief cited, which is that they are using data-driven, modeling to drive their strategy in the community, right? So do you know of examples where communities have been able to positively engage, let's just take the police, around a data-driven initiative?
Well, I'm not going to use the police today, but I am going to use some of the new innovative apps. Like, for instance, there was an app where you could report that there were potholes in your community, right? So if you're people who were online more and you had them, then that would mean that a set of communities that were more connected would get more of that. But they recognize that what might happen is that in poorer communities that might not happen because they're not reporting it at the level. So what they did was they made the app available to city workers who were all over the city, so they would be the first reporters, and then the community would be the backup, right?
Right.
I'm
This was
reporting
in Boston,
it.
I believe.
This
yeah.
was in Boston. They did this, and so what it says is, and I think that's true for all the things we're kind of discussing today, is that we have to be in tune with thinking about how we solve these problems on a macro basis, so that we haven't forgotten that everybody's not exactly the same, right? As you point out, all the communities are different. They may be targeted for different things, but maybe we can also focus on targeting them in a way that allows the process to work. Because you're absolutely right, data could be the difference between that second child who might not, in a world without it, have ever had a chance.
Right.
So
But now, if he
here's
can
another
do
one.
his, let me just finish. If
Oh,
he
I'm
can
sorry.
do his homework in the parking lot of McDonald's, hey, if he's so that motivated, he's going to close that divide on his own, or she.
That's where we should pick up as the example. So one of the places I think big data can be most helpful is in education. So the schools are collecting a fearsome amount of data about students now. And if you look at the GDP of the United States, let's turn this to a national issue. If you look at the GDP of the United States, so much of the growth comes from two populations, gifted and talented, and immigrants. Okay? So the gifted and talented in the communities we're talking about don't get a chance to contribute. But they're easy to identify at a very young age. So you can use the big data that are emerging from schools to pick them out, identify them, and then nurture the hell out of them to get them to very competitive colleges where they will then have outsized impact. I mean 1,000x, 10,000x impact on the GDP of the country, setting aside the community, which will have huge redounding benefits. That is not happening now. That is feasible through big data.
But one of the issues in ed tech, one of the biggest issues that we're seeing in communities is concern around how the data about parents are concerned how the data about their kids is going to be used. I mean, we saw a very, very well-funded entity that was making big strides or trying to make big strides in ed tech fold over these very issues because there wasn't enough disclosure and there wasn't enough comfort, there wasn't enough trust going back to Kim's incredible point around these issues. You know, can I touch on a couple of things that were raised here? And this also goes to something that was said in the last panel. You know, how do we focus on group identification versus individual identification? And Michael touched on this too when he talked about, you know, you are judged sometimes in the credit system by who your neighbors are. And we actually have a name for this. It's called ZIP+4 credit scoring. I mean, Michael talked about algorithms and the scoring of America, and we are living in a scoring society. So what happens when you are scored based not on your individual attributes, will you be able to pay a loan back, or are you a good customer, but who you live near and what your neighborhood is like.
Friends are.
Let's just talk for a moment about the neighborhood, okay, before we get to social media.
Okay.
ZIP+4, I believe, is something where we actually can take action. We can say that this falls under the Credit Reporting Act. And ZIP+4 scoring should involve all of the consumer rights and company responsibilities that falls under current law that's used for individual scoring.
Clarification,
Yep.
the FTC can take action on this or Congress?
I personally believe that it is time for us to say that the FTC can take action on ZIP+4 scoring.
If you're going to go for it, you need to move quickly, you know. Like, when do you anticipate that happening?
Oh, I'm just saying, you know, it's something that we're going to be thinking about and that we need to focus on. But my point is, if you make individual decisions, for instance, you're making an individual decision about me as to whether I can get credit or I'm a good customer, whatever it is, and it's based on me and my neighborhood. It's an individual decision you're making about me, even though the data is based on 4 or 5 families or maybe 15 families. I think and that's what ZIP+4 scoring is. I think at this point, we're at this day and age, this is a time when we need to say the Credit Reporting Act actually applies. But I'm sorry, there's one other thing I want to say. When it comes to kicking the tires around the multiplicity of scores that we have, I mean, Michael was referring to, you know, there's all sorts of scores out there. There's a company that says, you know, all data is credit data, right? All who your friends are, whatever. You know, there was a lot of suspicion about FICO scores back a couple of decades ago. And finally, Congress said to the FTC and to some of the banking regulators, you need to study FICO scores to make a determination as to whether it's having inappropriate impacts on certain communities. It took 3 years for our agency and some banking agencies to study whether FICO scores were having a disparate impact. That's a long time, that's a lot of resources, and it's one scoring mechanism.
Right.
We came out with a report and we showed that it was not having a disparate impact. It's one of the reasons why it is so ubiquitously used by the banking industry, because it was given more or less a clean bill of health. Now with all these other scores out there, who's monitoring them? Who is determining whether the data going in has a bias, whether coming out it has a disparate impact? And that's just the algorithm itself. And then there are all the questions around how they're being used. So this is a big project, and we do need a lot of industry input to help us trust the way these scores are being developed.
So there's something fundamental about the polarization that we're in politically now, right? That I feel like this approach in terms of the consumer perspective, like, are you being treated fairly as a consumer? That's a nonpartisan issue, right? Everybody is on the same side of, I don't want to be ripped off or treated unfairly by somebody who's going to either take my money or determine how much access I have to credit. But I want to come back to something else, and then if there are questions in the audience, we can go ahead and start lining those up. In the first presentation that David did, we saw the rise of minority voters and the trends in the country coming to 2044. We saw the usage of mobile and social. If you want to get elected president, I guess it's going to cost $5 billion was the number he cited, and the total run up to the election here. You have to use some of these same tools and tactics in order to reach these voters that you're trying to get to come over to your camp, right? So is there not some power for minority voters? I'm going to point this at you, Kim, and then let's get some questions. Is there not some power in being wanted, finally, right? Where Hispanic voters are not on the outside, they're driving certain markets. African American voters are driving certain precincts, and both parties are trying to figure out a way to appeal to these voters.
Well, I will tell you, everybody who knows me knows, I consider voting to be the most fundamental civil right of all the rights. So for all those grassroots organizations, kudos to Ben, NAACP, who get out there and who do this year-round, day in, day out. It's not a election time event. It's something they do all the time. That's why. Because finally people are starting to figure out that people who can vote can change schools, police chiefs. They can change, the economic conditions of a community. Well, that's everything, right? If we start there, then they can say, you know what, you won't digital redline my community because I want access to everything that's a part of this American dream. And digital, the innovation economy, is where we're going. So I encourage people. People say, oh, I picked and this person wasn't that good. Well, hold them accountable and let them know that you won't vote for them next time. We have to make sure that we use this process. It's worked all this time, and it will continue to work. And what you find is people are just trying to shave off who votes so that fewer people can pick. But if you're not fooled by that, you'll stand up and fight for it and make sure that that's the power that you use.
So should we be nervous, Michael, if the successful campaign for the 2016 presidential election deploys these tools, uses them to target voters in a way that could also be applied to redlining certain communities?
There's something that we can be optimistic about. So the person who did more than anyone else in the world of electoral politics to use big data was Mike Bloomberg. In his first and second elections, I think not the third election, but the first and second elections, he was very pioneering with his enormous wealth to run for mayor successfully as a Republican, which is itself a task in New York City. And what he did was enormous fine segmenting. And before his campaign, my understanding is that in the campaigns for political office, not only in New York but elsewhere, you basically had black people, white people, rich people, poor people, and so forth. What he found through a lot more nuanced segmenting is that West Indians in Queens had more in common with white people on the Upper West Side than they did with other black people in Queens. And, for example, I'm sort of making that up, but it's about close. And I like that because, as a Jewish guy who talks about Arab Israel a lot with a Muslim Lebanese nanny who wears a hijab, I find more in common with her as a human being than I do with some of the Jewish people who live down the street. And so I like the fact that big data taught us that there are things that are not just race, there are things that are not just zip code, there are things that are not just where we went to college, that define us, and that we have shared and common interests that transcend some of these things. Not every day, not all the time, but sometimes when it comes to voting and when it comes to messaging and when it comes to political interests. And so I would love to learn that I have more in common with voters from a different demographic, psychographic, from the one I expected. And so there's something nice about it, and there's something that starts to melt away some of these barriers that we've been redlined into psychically over time.
But there needs, I'm so sorry. There needs to be transparency around it.
Sure.
And I think, so I completely agree with your point, Kim, that this can really be something where voters can sort of say, and individuals can say, you don't protect me as a politician or whatever, I'm going to take action and vote with my feet. But you have to know what's happening. Yes. And in the absence of that kind of understanding, you're not able to make those choices.
That's algorithmic transparency.
But
So quick question.
it always goes back to the trust and the transparency, because what you described about West Indians in New York is the equivalent of saying, I took the time to understand their culture and what was important to them.
That's what Bloomberg did. Look, this is about algorithmic transparency. The chief of police in the previous panel, I'm going to put words in his mouth that may not be exactly right, but he said, look, we have 80% crimes against black people, and therefore we're going to go into this community and try to target it. Now you know his algorithm. You can like it, you can not like it, but you know the algorithm. And so what the algorithm in the machine, you don't know. Much more invisible. So the job is to surface it and make it visible and transparent so we understand it as well. Then you can like it or not like it, that's on you, but now you know it.
So why not start with the rule that every campaign has to do a forward promote of the various ways that they're doing data mining in order to get their communication strategy in place and do their ad buys?
Well, given how politicians act today, I mean, it goes back to what we're all saying is trust and transparency, right? If they're transparent, they're saying, look, I'm using the data to get to know the communities that I'm going to serve so that I can serve them effectively, and this is the examples of how I did it, well, then that's trust and transparency. Right. But if you're using it under the cuff and you have this secret algorithm and nobody knows what happened or why it happened, well, then now we know who you are.
Could we get that regulated, though? Could we ask that campaigns, as a way of educating the public on this issue, actually have to
I think we would have some serious First Amendment issues around political campaigns. It's one of first of all, the FTC, we focus on commercial relationships. Our Magna Carta says that we can go after unfair and deceptive acts and practices in commerce. So we're really focused on the commercial relationship rather than the political sphere.
Although they are using commercial companies to do this work.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Any questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Olga Figueroa, and I work for the local government, and we try our best to continually shift toward making data-driven decisions. Yeah. But something that I struggle with in my work is those people that we cannot capture with data. So in the last panel, and I think anyone that has been part of a civic organization or some organized organization knows that those that make the most noise, whether they're making it through taking surveys or using particular services to form these algorithms or to give us this data, a lot of people, like you said, they can't hop on the internet at a Starbucks or a McDonald's. They're in a food desert, which may make them be in, a digital desert, so we don't necessarily hear from those people, and everyone that does make noise are helping us make these data-driven decisions. So my question for the panel is, how do you go about trying to capture those people that aren't making noise but need those services the most?
Yeah, great question.
I'd welcome any suggestions.
No, when you consider that cell phone use is extraordinarily high among people of color, African Americans, Latinos, I think what becomes really important is that we find ways to connect. And I do think it's so funny, we're always talking about grassroots now. Well, you know what, even with the digital devices, some of this is going to have to go grassroots. We're going to have to go to where people are, and we're going to have to use the devices, right? If it's not broadband, then we're going to have to use the cell phones so that we get the way in, so that we can then connect them with the broadband and the access and the adoption so that they are those people too. Because if we leave them behind, I think that what people don't get is if we're all in the same ecosystem, and the garden is blooming all over here to the right, and there is no garden over here to the left, the dead soil is coming over. You know what I'm saying? It's not going to stay over there nice and neat and quiet.
It's like The Walking Dead, you're saying.
Exactly.
You're not safe.
You're not safe. So it's all of us that need to make sure that this is important.
But can I respond to this? Because I think, you've gotten like halfway to 75% of the way where you need to go, because you are recognizing the bias in. You're recognizing that the data that you're getting is not evenly distributed, and it's not representing some of the communities that you need to reach. That is a big, big step forward. And we talked earlier about the example of a city that recognized that too with their pothole fixing app. And so what they did is they said, all right, we're going to give this app to our city workers who are going all over. So I think recognizing the bias that's going in helps you recognize that the results that are coming out of whatever surveys you're doing or apps, or whether it's answering telephone lines, whatever it is, might not be representative. And you need to take extra steps to make sure that you're reaching everybody. So I think, that's a huge step forward, or recognition, so that when you're developing your data-driven results or your data-driven policies, you recognize that, well, we need to correct for this. We need to figure out a way to reach out to those
You can pull
others.
out where those places are so that you can decide, well, who is there?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get the question on this side.
Hi, my name is Raina Dotson. I'm not a data person, I'm not a techie, but this is really important discussion. Thank you. I wanted to ask, it sounds like, we've been talking about trust and transparency, and I also hear a lot about, like you, Michael, mentioned, that big data has shown us a lot about what commonalities we have. One big observation I've had, even carrying over from the previous panel, is that there's a fundamental lack of empathy that we have in society today. So I'm wondering, given the fact that we've become more fragmented, we're able to do more segmentation, we're able to be super specialized as a society, how can institutions think about how we're going to break that down when it's not the natural tendency of people to do that? I mean, I hear you saying we need that. We need to think about policies for how to transcend this fragmentation, but how can we actually in practice make that happen?
So just a quick time check. We have time for a quick response to this question, then we can get in one more question. So who wants to take it?
It's a great question. I wish I had an answer.
Technology is not empathetic.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to become empathetic. And that's not its job. Silicon Valley is not empathetic. Maybe it should become empathetic, but it doesn't. Silicon Valley is extremely fucking sincere about itself all the time. Okay, it has no sense of has no sense of irony. Okay, so that's Silicon Valley's major flaw. But technology is not empathetic. We need non-technologists to show us how to be empathetic. So I think it's back to you.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Tweet that answer. Yeah. Let's get this question in before we run out of time.
Great, thanks. My name is Crystal Hine with Politic 365, and there's this interesting tension, I think, that exists behind this idea of algorithmic transparency and kind of the consumer relationship to that. And one of the things in our, opt-out culture is that as long as it's free, I like it, right? And that's until you do a name search and you find all of your personal information in all of these different circles. How do we start to wrestle with that tension and kind of create a new sensibility around what this kind of new algorithmically based society means, and just try and cultivate a greater sensibility, especially for people who aren't necessarily privy to these kinds of conversations, who it's not a second thought to say, oh, well, yeah, I'll sign up for this service, that's fine, without a greater understanding of the potential consequences on the other side of that. Would love to get some.
I wrote a book on that topic.
I think it complements the question that came out, and I think now what this conversation says is, we can't just chat with ourselves. We have to go out and chat with other people, and we need to bring other people into these kinds of conversations. We need to bring the sociologists. We need to bring people who, that's how they think of the world in an empathetic way, and we need to let people see. I think that's the other thing. The messaging has to be, yeah, it's all about me, I love me, it's all about me, but in order for the me
I love that.
to get, right? It's in order for the me to get everything I want, I've got to connect.
Yeah,
I've got to be empathetic to this other side of the world, or I'm not going to get everything I want. Because I have to tell you, as the more you start to do messaging, we do multicultural media, we do a lot of messaging, and we find that if we don't connect with the I in people, then we can't get to the we. And so it is what
Charlie's
it is.
about to get to the we here.
The one
we
thing,
is coming,
the one thing
right?
I was going to add here is, in the data-driven economy, the coin of the realm is data, right? And so one of the things that we need to educate consumers about is, you're not paying for these services by paying with dollars. You're paying in the new coin of the realm, your data. And that's a message that we need to get out to everybody, to understand when you sign up for a sweepstakes or whatever, what's the likelihood you're actually going to win those sweepstakes? Probably pretty low, but where is that data going and how is it going to be used? It's a big, big question. So it's a lot of education, I think.
Great. All right. Join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you to the panel, and Joaquin, thanks for a great job.